Breaking tonight, Australia's strategic calculus just shifted in real time. Canberra didn't hesitate, they deployed. The Middle East is on fire tonight. U.S.-Israeli strikes have killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. A regional war has ignited, and 115,000 Australians are trapped inside it. Everyone assumed Australia would watch from the sidelines. Analysts expected Canberra to issue travel warnings and wait. Commentators believed Australia would defer entirely to Washington. They were all utterly wrong. Canberra, March 5, 2026. Inside the Australian Parliament, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese rose and delivered a statement that sent shockwaves through the chamber. The government is deploying 6 crisis response teams to the region, and we've already deployed military assets as part of our contingency planning earlier this week. Translation: Australia just told 115,000 of its citizens and the world that Canberra does not abandon its people, even in the middle of a war. And what happened next? The country that quietly pre-positioned aircraft across the Middle East before anyone even knew they were needed reveals exactly why Australia is no longer just a spectator in global crises, but a sovereign actor writing its own script. Dear viewers, on March 5th, 2026, something extraordinary unfolded inside Australia's parliament. 2 crises collided on the same day. One was military, one was diplomatic, and together they told a story about the kind of country Australia is choosing to become. Let's start with the military picture, because the scale of it matters. 2 officials confirmed to AFP what Albanese would only hint at in Parliament. Australia had deployed not 1, but 2 military aircraft to the Middle East, a heavy transport aircraft and a fuel transport aircraft. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were operational assets, pre-positioned for evacuations, fueled and ready to move Australians out of a conflict zone that is expanding by the hour. Think about what that means in practical terms. The United States and Israel struck Iran. They killed the supreme leader. A prominent cleric is now calling for, and I want you to hear this clearly, Trump's blood over the sinking of an Iranian warship. The region is not simmering, it is boiling, and inside that chaos, Australia's military is already on the ground. Officials told AFP that commercial flights remain the preferred route for Australians to return home. On Wednesday, the first of those flights landed in Sydney, passengers flying in from Dubai, one of the few cities still operating international departures out of the region. Canberra's consular teams are working around the clock, surging capacity, deploying crisis response teams, and engaging every partner agency. They have 115,000 citizens. A shooting war. 2 aircraft already in theater. This is not small, and Australia did it fast. But here is where the story gets bigger, far bigger than a single evacuation mission. Because on the exact same day that Albanese confirmed military deployments to Parliament, something else happened inside that chamber. Something that will be discussed in foreign ministries from Beijing to Washington for years to come. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, walked into the Australian Parliament and delivered an address that shook the room. It was the first time a Canadian leader had addressed Australia's parliament since 2007. Nearly 2 decades of silence, broken now in a moment of global rupture. Carney didn't come to talk about trade statistics. He came to talk about identity, about alignment, about what it means when 2 nations that share no border, no region, and no hemisphere choose each other anyway. In the mud of Flanders, on the shores of Normandy, in the hills of Korea and the valleys of Kandahar, Canadians and Australians have stood by each other when the hour was darkest and victory most in doubt. And then he said the quiet part loud, yes, the world will always be driven by great powers, but it can also be shaped by middle powers that trust each other and act with speed and purpose. Australia and Canada have demonstrated that trust again this week. Dear viewers, when a sitting prime minister uses the phrase this week in a parliamentary address, he is not speaking in abstractions. He is pointing at something specific. He is telling the world, watch what just happened here, because it matters. And what just happened here? Australia and Canada, the only 2 Western allies to immediately and explicitly support the US-Israeli strikes on Iran, stood together publicly and without hesitation at the precise moment when that support carried real geopolitical weight. Not when it was safe, not after consulting polling numbers. This week, that is not a coincidence. That is coordination. Now let's talk about the foundation being built beneath this alliance, because there is architecture here that goes far beyond warm words in a parliamentary chamber. Albanese announced that Australia would join Canada's G7 Critical Minerals Production Alliance. Read that sentence again slowly, because hidden inside that diplomatic language is one of the most consequential supply chain decisions of the decade. Here are the numbers, and numbers don't lie. Canada and Australia together produce approximately 1/3 of global lithium, 1/3 of global uranium, and more than 40% of global iron ore, 40% of iron ore. Between two countries, Western nations have spent the last 4 years scrambling to reduce their dependence on China, which still controls the majority of production and processing of critical minerals, the materials that go into semiconductors, electric vehicles, and advanced defense systems. Every AI chip, every fighter jet, every submarine battery, they require these minerals. China knows this. And for years, Beijing has used that leverage quietly and effectively as a backstop threat hanging over every diplomatic conversation in the Indo-Pacific. The Australia-Canada Minerals Alliance is a direct answer to that leverage, not a protest, not a press release. A production alliance, two nations sitting on a combined resource base of historic scale, agreeing to build, process, and supply together on their own terms. This is what sovereignty looks like when it's operational rather than rhetorical. But here is the detail that most people will miss, and that I want to make sure you don't. Opposition leader Angus Taylor, not a man known for foreign policy poetry, stood in Parliament and praised Carney for what he called a much-needed wake-up call for middle powers of the West. He quoted Carney's famous Davos speech, the one where the Canadian leader warned of a rupture in the world order, and then he went further. The rules-based international order has been exposed as wishful thinking of a bygone and benign era, especially in these times when autocratic regimes act with impunity. This is the opposition leader, speaking in bipartisan terms about the collapse of the post-war order. In Australian politics, that kind of language from both sides of the chamber on the same day in front of a foreign leader is not theater. It is signal. It is Canberra telling the world we have reached consensus. Australia is not going back to sleep. Taylor also called for deeper cooperation on defense, on secure supply chains, and sovereign capabilities on maintaining free trade. That is an agenda, not a platitude. It is a checklist for a new architecture of middle power cooperation that doesn't wait for Washington's permission to begin. And when asked directly, pointedly, whether Canada and Australia could trust Donald Trump, Carney's answer was measured but devastating in its implication. We need to build on what we have in order to reestablish that trust commercially. Reestablish. Past tense implies it was broken. That single word tells you everything about where the alliance calculus currently sits. Zoom out for a moment, because the full picture of this week is almost impossible to process in real time without taking a breath. The United States and Israel have killed Iran's supreme leader. A regional war is spreading. Australian sailors were on board the U.S. submarine when it torpedoed an Iranian warship. That story is not yet fully told. Canberra has deployed military aircraft to the Middle East. The Canadian Prime Minister is in Australia, inside Parliament, building an alliance framework. And two nations that together control a third of the world's lithium are formalizing a joint production strategy aimed directly at reducing Western dependence on China. This is not one story. This is 5 stories happening simultaneously, and they are all connected. The thread that runs through all of them is this: middle powers are not waiting for the great powers to save them. They are building the infrastructure of their own survival. Australia chose to stand beside the United States and Israel last week, not because Washington demanded it, not because it was politically safe, but because Canberra calculated that it was right. Canada made the same call. And now the two countries are standing in the same chamber, speaking the same language, and building the same alternative architecture. There is a word for this. It is called alignment. And in a world where the rules-based order is, as Taylor said, wishful thinking, alignment is the only currency that matters. Dear viewers, we are watching something rare. We are watching nations that should, by geography, by convenience, by every conventional logic of international relations, be peripheral, choose instead to be central. Australia and Canada do not share a border. They do not share a region. They do not share a hemisphere. And yet here they are, in the same chamber, in the same week, deploying military aircraft, signing mineral alliances, standing in Parliament and telling the world we will shape what comes next. Carney said it best, and it deserves to be the last word tonight. Australia and Canada have never waited for others to write our futures. We've written it ourselves through a century of choices. That century of choices is not over. It is accelerating. And tonight, with Australian aircraft in the skies above a Middle Eastern war zone and two middle powers forging the architecture of what comes next, we are watching that century write its newest, most consequential chapter. Stay with us. because this story is only beginning. If you want to understand the forces reshaping the Indo-Pacific, not from Washington's perspective, not from Beijing's, but from Canberra's, subscribe now and hit the bell. Because the next chapter arrives faster than anyone expects.